Thank you to all of our speakers. That was really wonderful. We are going to transition now to our panel discussion or panel session. And I think we've got a couple folks. Are we gathered up here? Okay, we've got our last person. Do we have enough seats? Okay. So what we're going to do here format-wise is I'm going to ask each of our panel members to offer up, maybe 3 or 5 minutes of their maybe takeaways and point of view on this topic, especially after hearing all of the speakers and the topics. As well, what I'd like to do is offer up a few questions for you to think about as you're offering those summaries or for further question. And this is based on what I've heard from everyone here today. First is that this definition or the definitions that have been proposed, some are extremely aspirational, if you will. In one case, I was thinking the only thing missing is world peace. I was like, we're about to solve it all here. What are your thoughts on the other issues that need to be considered? We were talking about societal change, not just agricultural practice and not just diet. You're talking about society, so the question is what else should be taken into account? Cultural, regions, religion, all of that kind of stuff. Also, what I heard was the requirement for a lot of behavior change. We were talking about a shift in population dietary practices, dietary patterns, a large shift in agricultural practices, meaning how things are farmed as well as what is farmed. Are we going to shift crops? What will be the predominant crops? And then finally, food waste. So how will that be achieved? And what are some of the anticipated challenges you see? Because those are all very large, population global shifts. And then another point that was made here was that sustainable currently means different things to different people. So I think the question was asked here in the audience, how then do you evaluate and move towards a global consensus on what it means and what kinds of policies or practices would have to be instituted globally, and how would that be achieved, and how would you measure the success? It seems like a very large undertaking. And then a final question is just coming back to some of these things is we heard, more push for organic, but then we also know that we have to achieve more efficient agricultural practices. What is the role then of breeding, biotech, and organic, and how will they coexist, or will they coexist as solutions to increase or address this food gap? So those are some questions I thought to just sort of seed for thought here. And then what we can do is we'll just start on this end and head down. And I just wanted to introduce our 2 other speakers here. Sorry, we have all of the speakers from this morning, as well as Dr. Janowski joining us and Dr. Ricky Yada as well. So with that, I'll let the panel expound a bit. Let's see, do we need to get you?
Great, yeah. I'll just grab this mic. So thank you very much. Let me start off by saying I feel like the last examiner in a PhD comprehensive, wondering what I should be saying because all the good stuff has been said before. And I wrote down some notes, and the analogy is Sharon Weiss's desk, that shot, where there was some useful information in that mirage of things. And so I wrote down some things, and I think I'm going to actually ask more questions than answers. But, as I listened to the discussion, there were things that came up, and you identified the issue around definition. Man, we need to get a real handle on what we mean by food and nutrition sustainability. And part of that is, understanding each other's jargon. And so we come at this from various perspectives, whether we come from an agronomy sector or food or nutrition, and then our social scientists are involved in this. And in developing networks, what I found that one of the things you really have to do right at the onset is actually define a common glossary of terms so that everyone understands what each other's talking about. The other thing in this whole food and nutrition sustainability issue is, what are the questions that we really want to ask? And to define some metrics around that, and then seeing if we can reverse engineer solutions. And that's a big issue of how do we do that? Well, one of the things that I don't think we do very well is identifying a portal by which people can come through to say, these are the issues, and having a single source kind of point of information to identify infrastructure, expertise, some of the other issues that we probably haven't identified. And one of those things, in talking to my colleague, the Dean of Applied Science or Engineering, is the whole issue around water. And we've heard a lot about food and nutrition security, but water plays a vital role here. And if you talk to the food companies as they set up various facilities, they talk about sanitation quality. And if you don't have food sanitation or water quality issues, then a lot of these things are moot. And so I think we need to look at that, soil issues, conservation, and we've talked about environmental impact. All of these things are really, really important. The other thing that I find, which is interesting, is that as we talk about moving towards 2050 and this whole increase in population, I think there's some naivety out there thinking that we have to produce more. Yeah, we probably do, but the naivety around, and Ferg, you brought this up, and Connie brought this up, around food processing. I think there's some naivety thinking that, food processing technology will remain status quo. There'll be some innovative stuff that'll occur, and this is the opportunity for all of us in this room to share in this public-private partnership to come up with some innovative strategies, technologies, products to meet this burgeoning population growth. I think the challenge will be, and this is from an academic perspective, how do you actually fill the valley of death, where you go from that great idea to actually having an innovative product or technology that's accepted by the consumer or by the clientele? And this is a big, big problem, because you need probably significant capital to do that. And that's always been a challenge. And then finally, I think we need to identify who is the client group that we're talking about. And I think yesterday in the discussion around this issue, Ferg, I mentioned, the issues around working with food banks. In our own city, there's a food and nutrition security issue within our own cities where, I guess the notion of food banks was if there's any discarded food in your cupboards, you gave it to the food bank. And the food bank guys are going, stop, we're not doing that anymore. We're worried about the health status of our client groups, and those are the people who come. So we need to identify who the client groups are, whether it's those people who go to the food banks, the general population, or programs such as food aid. So with that, Madam Chair.
Okay, yes, why don't we bring it back to Barbara?
Yep.
Why don't we give Adam, I'd say let's give
Okay.
Adam, we haven't heard from him.
Yes, I would like to go back to the definitions. And out of the definitions we heard for sustainable diets and sustainable food and nutrition security, the one I like best is the one provided by Barbara Schneemann in one of her slides. This is the old 2010 definition from FAO, and I'll just remind you what it says. It says the diets have to be healthy, safe, nutrient-dense, affordable, culturally appropriate, have a low environmental impact as measured in terms of energy, water, and land use, and be sparing of human and environmental resources for the present and future generations. Okay, she called it aspirational. I call it full of contradictions in terms. You simply cannot have it all, and compromises have to be made, because foods which are nutrient-rich are not the most affordable. On the contrary, it is the nutrient-poor foods that are cheaper. Foods which are sustainable are not necessarily nutrient-rich. Foods which are sustainable and nutrient-rich are not necessarily culturally appropriate, and people don't even like them. So what to do? In fact, there is an inherent danger in thinking that nutrition is calories and environmental impact is to be measured in terms of greenhouse gas emissions only. Because in fact, when you look at data from the United Kingdom and from France and from Denmark, United States data on this point are completely lacking, but when you look at data from European countries, you start realizing there's one plant-based crop which is very sustainable in terms of low greenhouse gas emission, low water use, low land use, and that plant crop is, in fact, you knew it, sugar. So you could call sugar sustainable, except a diet of sugar would not necessarily fit in with the FAO definition of health and nutrient density and so on, which means, and this is the first big point, that the discussion of nutrition and health has to be an integral part of any discussion of sustainable diets. The FAO definition puts it very clearly. It is nutrition and health that is an integral component on whether we decide if a diet is sustainable or not. So that's the first big point. The second big point is that trade-offs need to be made, and it's very unclear. I think Fergie was saying earlier on, we would need linear regression models. Actually, what we would need is linear programming models, and those are the very kind that were used in the Live Well report. This was a linear programming model selecting the optimal diet under a number of constraints. And there are other ways of looking at diets which are nutrient-rich and have at the same time low calculated greenhouse gas emissions and low water use. And that gets me to the next point, and the next point is that when you start looking at those things, you need to start developing domains, and for each of those domains there has to be a metric. And to have those metrics, you need data. And this is precisely what Simpsons is doing, because we're now looking at the potential domains of sustainable nutrition security. And so far, I've identified 4: nutrient density. There are metrics for that at the level of individual foods, meals, as Anne was pointing out earlier, and total diets. So we can assess what we mean by nutrient density at the level of foods, meals, and diets. Affordability. We have affordability metrics, which we didn't talk about very much. Some of those foods do not cost the same. It's going to make a difference to the consumer. Cultural appropriateness, the third domain. What are we asking people to eat? Are we asking them to replace the beef with lentils? You know, may or may not work. We don't know. Let's take a look at that. Cultural appropriateness metrics. And then we have the environmental impact metrics, which go beyond greenhouse gas emissions and which go in the direction of water use, land use, pesticide, land degradation, deforestation, and so on. They all fit together. And the other 3 metrics, I'm thinking of 7 metrics, are still grabs. Indeed, the US legal definition of sustainability is the only one which talks about the economic viability of farms and the life quality of farmers. So that could very well be the 5th metric. And then we could have waste. I think it's a huge, big issue at the moment, totally under-researched, and we don't really know much about it in the United States yet. And then the final one, I probably would look at something like climate resilience. What is going to happen in the face of climate change or climate challenge? So here you are with those ideas. First of all, you cannot have it all. There must be trade-offs and compromises. We need to have domains and metrics, and for each of those metrics, we need to have data, and those data include collecting data on nutrient composition of foods, dietary intakes, distribution of food intake in the population, and so on, because we really need to be able to quantify all those things and arrive at an optimal model for a healthy diet, probably using some kind of mathematical modeling and backed by what people already eat. It actually is easier to look at the sustainable diets already consumed by a segment of the population than come up with a completely new diet created by a computer and saying to the population, eat this, the computer knows best. So we need to go to reality and find out what will and what will not be accepted. And I think that this is exactly the area where public-private partnerships coincide. So I'll finish here. Thank you.
Jack, would you like to offer up, and we can just work back this way?
Sure. So I thought I might comment a little bit on the question of organic and biotech as something, how do we figure out how to make this work? And I think, too often it's seen as either or. How do we make organic the de facto norm or conventional agriculture? And I think it's really missing the point of what we have to achieve by 2050 or 2100. If you are a conventional farmer, you may look at organic and say, well, it's 10 to 30% less efficient, and we need to be producing more food, and so that alone would require the destruction of all the rainforest in order to achieve organic for the world. And if you're an organic farmer, you would say, well, eutrophication of waterways, if we just expand this by another 60%, then we're going to have some different problems. And I think a different way of looking at it is looking at organic production as a test bed for certain agricultural practices that don't necessarily make economic sense today but might tomorrow. And so an example of that would be cover crops. I think that without the push of organic farmers to develop cover crops as something to be using between planting season, conventional farmers wouldn't really be looking at it today. And companies that are producing seeds didn't really see it as a market, but in the future they might. And what I'm excited about is the use of big data to reveal small differences. And so in the past, a cover crop, it might take years to know whether or not it would make sense to do, and farmers wouldn't take that time. But today you can aggregate the data from 1 million farms, and you can say, you know what, this is exactly what the economic benefit is to you. And so I think that the opportunity to move ideas from agricultural practices from one side to the other has never been greater. And so 4% today of organic, may be the right mix. By 2100, it could be that it's just the opposite mix, but it's going to look completely different than what we have today. And I think that, we tend to project the future based on the past, and we all know that what we expect to happen seldom does. And I was talking to soybean farmers 2 weeks ago, and I told them, I said, by 2050, I don't think there will be any soybean farmers in America. And they thought that was a little shocking. And I said, the difference is you're going to be high oleic and low linoleic, and you're all going to be producing a value-added soy, and that's going to be good. You're not going to be in the commodity business anymore. And so the opportunities that exist in the future are hard to anticipate, and yet the opportunities are still there. And so I think we need to be able to find ways of working with one and the other. And I think that's the challenge that we face, but it's also the opportunity that we have.
So I was going to respond a little bit to the policies question that you raised, because I didn't go into that at all in my talk. So it seems like there's a few categories of policies that we need depending on what solutions we're trying to advance, right? So in some areas, we will need more research and development, right? We need better technology. In some places, technology is already there, and we need extension services and so on to make sure that farmers are able to incorporate those technologies. It seems like there's also across the different solutions, we need to have the right incentives in place to reward efficient resource use. And there's a lot of, especially in the developing world, where farmers don't have many resources to install maybe some of the necessary technologies needed for more efficient resource use. I mean, who's going to pay for that? And so this goes into questions of maybe subsidy reform. There's water subsidies, fertilizer subsidies encouraging overuse that could be then redirected to subsidizing or supporting the good stuff. And then one other thing from the policy standpoint is for looking at agriculture going forward and planning for growth, there needs to be more planning at the landscape level. So focusing beyond individual farms and looking at land use planning and coastal zone planning and so on to make sure that we're making the most efficient use of resources.
I'd like to come back to the question was raised earlier about the costs of natural capital. And this is an extremely difficult one because they're not integrated properly today at all, and particularly in the area of water. If you look at the actual price of water, it bears no relation at all to the actual water scarcity in the area. So what we've done at Nestle is we've introduced a notional cost of water that is related to the water stress in that particular region. And we use this notional cost of water within our investment calculations, because if we just took the real cost, we'd never meet the payback criteria. So, for example, we've just started up a factory in Mexico, in the region Lagos de Moreno, where we have a big dairy plant, and this is a highly water-stressed area, and water is cheap. And this plant we've just started up is zero water. So we're actually now a net discharger of water. So all the water used in the processing of milk comes from the water in the cow's milk. And it's purified using reverse osmosis, ultracentrifugation, membrane bioreactors. It's purified to the level required for the process. And you know, using this notional cost of water, this is how we were able to justify that in investments. So we've analysed our other milk plants in the world, looking at water stress and volumes, and prioritise the rollout of these technologies. And we're currently introducing that in Mossel Bay in South Africa, and also in the plant in Pakistan. So this is just one illustration of how you can start to integrate the true cost of natural capital in the investment calculations.
A couple of things. Jack alluded to something that I'm concerned about it, and one of the things we're going to have to rid ourselves of is this notion of purity. So, you know, we can't have like pure organic foods, you know, and Jack alluded to this, and we can't have pure natural foods, and you know, there's going to have to be some compromise on these if we're going to really address these, and in order to compromise on these, there's going to have to be an understanding by the consumer, at least in the developed world, and I think that's going to take some compromise on the various people involved, including agriculture and the food manufacturing industry and the fertilizer industry and biotech and consumer activist groups. And I think those are going to have to get together, and we're going to have to learn how to market this. I mean, we're having very great difficulty coming up. I mean, we're talking about linear modeling, which I agree with, but that's amongst ourselves. But then how do we sell that whole notion of what sustainability really means to the consumer? And so I think we'll have to work with, for instance, in the U.S., with the real food movement that's going around the country, and every major university in the country, and their idea of sustainability is far different than what we've been talking about. But they're the people who buy the foods, and they're the people that are going to make it worthwhile or not to do all this. You know, one of our students said, you know, technology is fine for Apple, but it's no good for apples. And, you know, that's the kind of thing we have to understand and work towards when we talk about this, because this is not something we're going to use to sell product. As been said by many of the speakers so very well, this is something that we're going to use to let the planet and its people continue to sustain themselves and to continue to exist. And it's much more important than selling product, and I think we have to get everybody together in order to understand that. So.
Thank you. I know we are standing between you and lunch. I'm standing between myself and lunch, so I'll make this quick. The private sector has a lot at stake and is in the best position to tackle some of the urgent sustainability issues that are threatening their very business models. As you know, investors increasingly recognize the link between sustainability and financial performance and long-term shareholder value, there is an increasing pressure on companies to report on their sustainability risks with the same level of rigor as they do financial risks and financial performance. The determination that many companies have shown over the past 2 years to solve these problems shows that, you know, it's admirable, and it shows that these problems can be solved if there's enough willpower and if people come together and start working on them. At the end of the day, though, I think the biggest challenge is going to be efficient consumption. No matter how sustainably food is produced, if consumption patterns aren't addressed, then, you know, finite resources are going to be stretched, and water, land, and our climate are finite resources that need to be valued appropriately in business decisions. So I think most of my panelists made all the points very well, but I especially liked Jack's quote in the beginning that I think we can, and people would love to hear that they could eat their way towards a sustainable future.
guess the analogy is many people, they can eat their way out of an overweight problem too. So when I tackle a challenge that I hear in all your questions, I use a framework, which is purpose, principles, values, and issues. I think our purpose is to define sustainability in a way that's useful going forward. Principles are key beliefs that we should all hold and feel are valuable. Values are what are you willing to invest in because of your principles. And issues are the things that stand in the way. And I think a lot of our discussion so far has been around the issues. The reason I like this framework is it lets you collect all those issues, but at some point we have to come back and talk about the principles. What are our core beliefs around defining sustainability? Some of the things I've heard, or I think I've heard, that might be principles. Any definition has to consider the present as well as the future, because that's what sustainability gets us to, is the future. We have to get the incentives right. To me, that is a key principle. What are the incentives that lead us to a more sustainable future? I've heard innovation as a principle, that we have to find ways to allow experimentation so we can figure out what practices are going to be most useful. With respect to nutrition, and which is my perspective I bring into this, certainly we've heard that there are many approaches to meet dietary recommendations. When I go back to the preparation and use of food-based dietary guidelines, a key principle there was to start with the public health issue. The public health issue in the United States is not the same as the public health issue in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have to keep respecting that. What are the public health issues? In terms of values, things that I've heard people are willing to invest in, waste seems to be something that everybody brings up as a place to invest. Actually, one thing I thought of as a value, but it may be a principle, that the environmental target is not always a nutrition and health target. Sometimes we're using those things to try and justify each other, but sometimes the environmental target is just that. The nutrition or health impact may be neutral, but the environmental target is still worthwhile. What trade-offs are we willing to make? And that becomes, what are we going to invest in, and how do we enable experimentation? Some of the issues I've heard, all behavior has an impact. We're not getting out of this free. All behavior has an impact. I also hear a lot of issues around what is the environmental target that we're most after. Do we have to come up with some way of synthesizing what those environmental targets are? Do we identify one that we go after? The issues can go on, and I think if we look back over the presentations, we would have a very long list of issues that are standing in the way. But to me, to get to a definition, we at some point have to figure out what our principles are.
Thank you. We're going to now take some questions from the audience. One thing I would encourage both our panelists and those asking the question is to keep kind of driving on this definition. I think we heard some really interesting points of view here collectively, and I've kind of narrowed it down just a little bit. What I have heard is incentive, compromise, communication, and that we need in some capacity to anticipate and plan for the unintended. Well, we don't know what that is, right? But in the question from the audience previous was, what do we know is good, or how do we know it's good, and we've gotten in trouble before. So I think those are key learnings. So we'll take questions now. Thank you.
Elaine Krull, DuPont Nutrition and Health. I couldn't help but 3 different speakers mentioned soy in the context of sustainability, and since that's close to my heart, I was struggling because in the definition, I do agree that it's listed as one of the commodities that is leading to the greatest deforestation. But at the same time, more than 90% of the soybean meal is used to feed animals. And 10% is used for human consumption. So I guess the people that are using soy in the context of a human food product are being penalized for the deforestation being done in the case of animals. And I don't know how you segregate that. But if we used all the soy just for human consumption, and I don't think the soy farmers are going to be reducing their use of soy. Yes, the soybean oil may be more high oleic, but the meal goes to feed animals, and they're not just going to throw the meal away. So it's still a major source. I don't know how you differentiate between sustainability, between something intended for animal consumption, which then goes into human versus human consumption directly.
That is a great question, and I realized I didn't emphasize something in my presentation in that palm oil, because it is such an urgent and high-profile issue, has really captured a lot of companies' attention and focused companies' attentions on the urgencies around sustainable sourcing and deforestation. And the standards put in place around palm oil are really cutting edge and leading best practice. However, those issues are obviously not unique to palm, and a lot of companies are starting to broaden those commitments, and the expectation is that companies broaden those commitments to cover all commodities. Wilmar is the largest trader of palm oil. They're also a massive soy trader, and in fact, Cargill announced at the UN Climate Summit a few months ago that every commodity it trades will be decoupled from deforestation, which is huge. However, very accurate point that a lot of the soy goes to feed animal livestock, which brings me, I work a lot on sustainable sourcing, as I said, but I still keep coming back to this point of recognizing that if consumption patterns continue, particularly growing demand for meat, then it is inherently very challenging to just have perfectly efficient sourcing and expect no environmental impacts.
Oh, come on, we've got to have more questions. Kathy, get up there. Ask us a question.
Thank you. This has been a fabulous session. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but it's definitely exceeded my expectations and is very thought-provoking. So my question really is around coming back to the consumer side of it, since being from General Mills, we have to always put that lens on things. And so, and I don't know if I'll be able to articulate this question very well, but can consumer expectations for sustainable food production coexist with their desire for simple food labels? And in some cases, that might affect the ability for companies to fortify foods. And Anne, you talked about the food fortification piece of this, but what some of the things we're starting to see is that because in the case, again, and this is maybe very much from a developed country standpoint, if the labels are very complex, then they may or may not think that's as good of a product. So it's kind of looking at this from a variety of ways. And then there is also the overlay of the regulatory requirements in certain countries around that. And so there's sustainability, but there's also this piece of how do you effectively deliver the nutrients in those cases. So
I just had one comment on it. I really think that with our existing government agencies, that if we left it up to them to label sustainability, that we would never have anything, one, that was useful, two, that the consumer understood, and three, that would ever get done. So I think that that's going to be a real stopper in terms of telling people what sustainable is, even if we got a really good definition, because if you give it to a government agency, we'll never see it again.
We can't put much more on the labels, it's already so cluttered, and we know that consumers really don't understand a lot of what is on the food labels. So we're trying other approaches. One of them, we call it Beyond the Label, so this uses 2D barcodes to take the interested consumers to information on the social aspects, nutrition aspects, and environmental aspects of the specific product. So that is one means. And the other thing we've been experimenting on is to understand the nutritional quality of diets. So we've been piloting an app which is based on the nutrient balance concept that I described. And it allows it's a meal planner for mothers with their children, and is linked to a big database of recipes. And so they can call up the recipe. It calculates out the nutritional value of this, including micronutrients. And then you can call up, a green salad, a yogurt, other components to increase the nutritional value of the meal. So that's one first step in that direction, to have information in a compelling and understandable form to be able to make dietary choices. And later on we want to include also the environmental component. But it's challenging to keep it simple and understandable.
I'm surprised you don't think that the government can solve all your problems. When I think about consumer expectations, I mean, one of the challenges is that expectations, drive some of the labeling, and those labels then drive marketing of those products, which increases the expectations that you're going to have that. So if you may not believe that gluten-free is good for those who don't have celiac, but, if those are the products flying off the shelves, you're sure as heck going to produce that product. And, you're giving the consumer what they want, but the consumer wants safe and healthy food, and they believe that is. And so it was in the book Nudge by Sunstein and Thaler, they said that when consumers have a false belief, it's more often in the interest of industry to cater to the belief than to try to eradicate it. And, that's not surprising, but, there is the question of the core values that the consumer has, that I think a lot of what we're trying to do is figure out how to help the consumer meet their core value, even when it goes against their expectation of what their core value is. And that's a tough thing to do, but I think it's an important thing to do. When it comes to the example of pink slime, we add in this dimension of social media and the fact that, we used to have weeks to respond and draft a press release and come out with our talking points, and now if you don't respond in the way and in the time frame that people expect, you're not part of the dialogue. And so nowhere during that discussion was the fact that if we get rid of lean, finely textured beef from the food supply, that's a choice, and it has very little economic impact on us, but it also means getting rid of 400 to 800 million pounds of perfectly safe product a year, which coincidentally is about the food waste of the country of Belgium. So sure, we can add an entire country's food waste to the landfills every year, but that's a consequence that wasn't really articulated. And I think that the yuck factor is different from, well, I don't necessarily want it, but that doesn't mean I don't want somebody else to have it. And it's a discussion that we just didn't have.
I wanted to just come back a little bit to what Ferg said, because he is correct. This would be a challenge for government to take on. But the challenge is because there is not agreement. If you look at what happens to natural, I know everyone says they want a definition of natural, but it turns out everybody wants their definition of natural. And so the reason the government can't move forward is because there is no consensus. There is no agreement. And so if the process that ILSI is beginning gets to a point where there is more of a common understanding, there is more of a common definition, if it's useful to have it also in government code, there is a process to move that forward. But to expect government to jump in and solve a disagreement amongst everyone, it doesn't necessarily improve the process. It's better for really through a public-private partnership, whatever, to come up and begin to hone in on what are the principles that are most important here. How should we move forward in this area? And Kathy, I have to I'm of an age where I can remember the solution to the food problem was formula, and you add your vitamins and minerals, and you're done. You drink it in the morning, you're done. And thank God that's not where we've come out with food. And so, yes, people want food that has a real nature to it. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. It's how do we make sure that we're realistic, industry is realistic, and consumers are realistic in terms of what those things mean and how it's defined.
I just would like to say that I disagree with that. But anyway, I think that whether government labeled it or not, I think that we do have to move towards this. I do agree with that. And I think as we move towards it, we have to bring in all the groups that are involved and get them to compromise on what they're talking about in order to get this compromise position that at least everyone understands. And when we get to what everyone understands, maybe then we don't have to worry about the government.
Exactly. All right, Dave.
Hi, Dave Schmidt, International Food Information Council. And kind of following on the themes of the appropriate roles of government or not, as many of you know, in the U.S., the members of Congress and others have raised issues with the scope of the Dietary Guidelines Committee bringing in sustainability. And it's interesting in this discussion, I think we would all probably agree the public health benefit of having dietary guidance and also the importance of sustainability. But what are the unintended consequences of kind of forcing the marriage of the two in a process like dietary guidance, and how much of you, I guess those of you that have been involved with the process, can you comment on the likelihood of the federal agencies actually adopting the recommendation to have this marriage?
I think I can definitely not comment on the likelihood.
Since I don't work for government, I can comment on that. I don't know what the likelihood is of adopting it. When I go back to that process that was begun by FAO, WHO, the fact that you have to bring a broader spectrum in for expertise on dietary guidelines, I guess this is a natural flow from that. What I find intriguing in the process now is I think of the dietary guidelines process as define what those recommendations should be, recognize that there are various approaches to meeting those recommendations, and then ask questions. Are there sustainability or production issues that we should be aware of as we think about our entire food system? I see us turning the whole process around. We're saying, this is what's sustainable from an environmental point of view. That's a justification for the dietary guidelines. And so I see that flip happening without much discussion around it. In the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Committee, they did have a recommendation on fish. And somewhere in the notes you can find that discussion of, we'd have to think about what it means for the American population to suddenly start eating fish at the level that the DGAC recommended. And it's not, I don't think it's necessarily for the DGAC to answer that question, but certainly to put the issue out there that as we think about these recommendations and how we're going to meet them, how do we address these other questions that then are raised in the process? Okay, next.
I love examples where sustainability and nutrition peacefully coexist, and certainly want to recognize the great work that Nestle has done. But coming back to Dr. Janowski's comments about some of the apparent contradictions that can exist, and also recognizing the challenge, because we probably don't have a perfect definition right now in terms of what sustainability means. But I'd like to maybe put the panel a little bit on the spot and say, are there certain areas that particularly concern you, as whether we take a consumer-based definition of sustainability or some more evolved definitions of sustainability in terms of how it could negatively impact nutrition for the population?
Can you repeat that last part of your question?
Yeah, so what I'm specifically interested in is how, let's maybe starting with a consumer-based perception of sustainability, how putting that into play may adversely affect diet quality. So in other words, are there places where we could actually see a decline in the nutrition being delivered to the population if recommendations are based in sustainability? Like, the way that I would say it is that I love to see those things peacefully coexist, but I'm frankly concerned that in some cases, I'll give a specific example. If a consumer is thinking sustainability is eating locally, that's going to limit the availability of certain fresh fruits and vegetables, or certain fruits and vegetables at different times of the season. Therefore, the diet quality could go down. So I'm very interested in terms of what might be the limitations or how the sustainability movement could hurt nutrition quality of the diet.
Yeah, the example I always come back to relates to, the center of origin for maize, in Mexico. Let's say we're in Oaxaca. And, certainly the existence of the biodiversity of those land races is critical and it's important. And so the UN guidance suggests that one of the things that we can do is we can look at different crops to try to identify varieties that are more nutritious. And then we can somehow select those. Well, if we went to Oaxaca and we identified the land races that were higher in protein or vitamin A or something else, and then we encouraged all the farmers in Oaxaca to start growing those, we would decrease biodiversity and we'd increase nutrition. Or we could say, we need that biodiversity in Oaxaca, and therefore we're not going to encourage farmers to use new varieties that would clearly deliver greater health and nutrition to the people, but it would be at a cost of biodiversity. And so I think anytime we're talking about a place that has large biodiversity, you're sort of stuck with that. Do we want them to maintain it for us, or do we want to put it on, in cold storage in Svalbard? So I think that those are really important trade-offs, and they don't really show up in the UN draft guidance yet.
I think the question is an important question, and I will put a little plug in for SimSan, since I help with some of the nutrition, looking at some of the nutrition issues. And one of the items that we came back to over and over again is that one of the simplest ways to look at nutrition adequacy is to usually look at calorie availability. And certainly in many parts of the developing world, that's an important indicator to be looking at. But once we go beyond calories, then dietary diversity becomes an important factor, because how do we get the micronutrients delivered and the things we don't even know about yet delivered? And so I think that is part of this challenge. Do we have the right metrics in place so that when we're looking at how we're tackling an environmental issue, do we know how best to measure the nutritional impact from a diversity point of view, not just a calorie point of view? And it certainly sounds like Nestle is trying to take that approach, and I know that SimSan is taking that approach as well.
Yeah, Jeff Smith, ILSI Southeast Asia Region, fantastic presentation discussion. Two quick questions. The first is a general one on mechanisms. So we've had a lot of really good presentations, discussion about sustainability and why it's valuable and why we need more sustainability in the future and more production. But can you imagine what will be the mechanisms by which that sustainability will be encouraged and incentivized? So the pricing mechanism is valuable. If crops are needed and the price goes up, there's incentive to increase production. But water is mostly outside the pricing mechanism. Regulation is another mechanism for achieving results, but do we know enough to do regulation? So that's one question I put on the table. Second is more specific. Dr. Erland mentioned about the commitment from Nestle to increase fortification and even biofortification, which I found very interesting, because fortification is a biofortification. There are not many countries in the world where you can even buy biofortified crops. But I want to direct this question to the issue of standards, which was raised earlier. It seems to me that companies and groups of companies have potential to increase nutrition by defining their own purchasing standards to a higher level. So commodity, that may be still fitting within a commodity standard, but they could define a higher level of beta-carotene content or iron content in certain crops. I'd be interested in comments on that particular mechanism as a way of, because farmers don't get paid for better nutrition, right? If they have a greater level of beta-carotene, who pays them for that? But food processing companies could implement such kind of standards.
Maybe I can make a comment on that last point. Effectively, one of the things we're struggling with is that, in general terms, most seed companies haven't been very interested in nutrition, and it's because the output has been yield, and disease resistant. But biofortification seems to be a kind of a door opener in order to really initiate those discussions with seed companies, because there can be varieties that they have discarded which still have very close to the same yields but include these micronutrients. So this is the kind of approach we're taking in the discussions and effectively altering the specifications. But it's a long job to establish the supply chain of these new biofortified grades.
Yeah, I'm coming back. I mean, the key question is how to increase the demand. So farmers, if I generalize, do what they're paid for. And they're generally paid to increase the yield per hectare and reduce the cost. But if there is a demand, and Nestle demanding would be a significant demand in the world, for a crop with a better nutritional profile, that could be a valuable focus, especially if it was shared by other companies.
Yeah, but that's exactly what we're trying to do. So to create the pool so that particularly smallholder farmers will grow these crops, we will be able to buy it, we'll have more nutritious products, and the smallholder farmers who use part of their crops for their own consumption, their nutritional status will be improved. And many of these smallholder farmers really don't buy much processed food. So this, should be a win-win solution. But as I say, we have to start using more of this, and it's establishing those supply chains is really important and challenging.
How about one last question?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting session. I'm Laura Fernandez from the European Food Information Council, and my question is of a communication nature. In Europe, we have a proliferation of soft claims on food labels around palm oil, stating without palm oil or free from palm oil, that creates a negative perception around the ingredient. So my fear is that despite all these efforts towards using or increasing the usage of certified palm oil from sustainable sources, we are maybe failing the battle or not winning the battle, because the consumers ultimately will be looking by presence or absence of the ingredient and not whether it is certified or not. So I would like to know whether you have a similar situation in the States, and what are your thoughts of what can be done to address that?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think another one of the labeling requirements there contains a sustainable palm oil. And I think raising awareness about the issues associated with palm oil has been a huge driver in shifting practices. So I think raising consumer awareness about the issue is really critical, and simply raising consumer awareness about, where palm oil is just, it's in everything, it's very widely used, plays an important role. And I think the messaging that has been out there from almost every group has been not don't use palm oil, is source palm oil sustainably. So I think consumers would have an extremely difficult time trying to find products that don't use palm oil. And I think, most companies, environmental groups, investor groups, any group that's really pushing on this, the messaging is, use palm oil sustainably. So my hope is that most companies will choose to use the sustainably sourced palm oil label.
Well, I would just say, to some extent, the expansion of the use of palm oil in Europe was a response to the trying to reformulate products so that they didn't use GM ingredients, and so that it was industry trying to avoid a negative label, and so they did that, and now there's a certain stigma attached to the deforestation related to palm oil, and so again, people are trying to avoid that, and so consumers are listening to what the messaging is, and we need to make sure that the consumer gets the correct message overall, and so I think we need to be willing to engage in all of these discussions, and it's not just palm oil, or it's not just biotech or soybean oil or other things. I think that I want to just quickly on the other point that was made, though, about products. We have the Plenish soybean oil, which is a value-added soy product. And so I do think that there will be this opportunity in the future for more products that are developed that are intended to provide dietary benefits to the public. And I think we're just at the beginning of that. And so whether it's genetically engineered or not, I think that a lot of companies are working on things that have dietary benefits, and that's because of a pull from the consumer.